There is a phrase that appears simple, almost harmless when spoken, yet carries a weight most people never stop to examine. His money is my money, and my money is my money. It shows up casually in conversations, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as an expectation, and often as something so normalized that it goes unquestioned. At first, it sounds like partnership. It sounds like closeness, like two people building a life together where resources are shared and burdens are eased. That is the story people are used to hearing. That is the lens through which they interpret it. And within that lens, the idea feels reasonable. But the moment you slow down and look at the structure of that statement, something begins to shift. Because it is not symmetrical. One side remains protected, the other becomes accessible. One person retains full control over what they earn, while the other is expected to open access not by negotiation, but by default. And that is where the tone quietly changes, even if no one says it out loud. The question is no longer about sharing. It becomes a question of entitlement. Who has the right to decide how another person's effort is used? At what point does care turn into expectation? And when does expectation stop being a choice and start becoming an obligation? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones, because once you begin to follow them to their conclusion, what once looked like a normal dynamic no longer feels so simple. To understand why this dynamic becomes problematic, you have to begin with a comparison that most people instinctively reject. Ask a simple question. Does one person in a relationship have a right to the other person's body? For most people, the answer is immediate. No, a person's body belongs to them. It is not something that can be claimed, demanded, or accessed without consent. Even within a relationship, even within marriage, that boundary is considered fundamental. Any violation of it is seen as deeply wrong. But then the conversation shifts. Replace the word body with money, and suddenly the clarity disappears. What was once obvious becomes negotiable. What was once unacceptable becomes, in some contexts, expected. This inconsistency is where the real issue begins. Because money feels different. It feels less personal, less sacred. It is easy to treat it as just a resource, something external, something separate from the self. And because of that, people begin to justify claims over it in ways they would never justify claims over the body. But this separation is an illusion. Money is not just paper or numbers. For most people, money is the stored result of their time. It is the product of hours spent working, thinking, solving problems, enduring stress, applying effort. It is what remains after someone has traded pieces of their life in exchange for value. In that sense, money is not separate from the person. It is a compressed form of their time and energy. And time is something you can never get back. Every unit of money represents something that was spent attention, effort, physical or mental exertion. Whether someone is working with their hands or their mind, their body is always involved. Labor is never abstract. It is always embodied. So when you say that you are entitled to someone else's money, what you are really saying is that you are entitled to the product of their labor. And if you are entitled to the product of their labor, then logically you are one step away from claiming a right to that labor itself. This is where the argument becomes difficult to ignore, because labor is not something that exists on its own. It requires action. It requires time. It requires the use of a person's body and mind. To claim entitlement to it, even indirectly, is to place a demand on how that person must use themselves, not through force, but through expectation. And expectation, when it becomes normalized, does not feel like pressure. It feels like obligation. It becomes something the other person is supposed to do, not because they freely choose it, but because failing to do so violates the unspoken rules of the relationship. This is how asymmetry forms. One person begins to operate under a set of expectations that the other does not share. One person's resources are open to claim, while the others remain protected. One gives because they feel they must. The other receives because they feel it is justified. And over time, that imbalance reshapes the relationship itself. What began as a connection between two individuals slowly turns into a structure, a system where roles are defined not by mutual agreement, but by underlying beliefs about who owes what to whom. And the more invisible that system is, the more powerful it becomes. To fully understand the weight of that system, you have to look at what money actually does in a person's life. Money is not just a resource, it is leverage. It determines how easily you can leave a bad situation. It determines how much pressure you can resist. It determines whether your choices are real or merely theoretical. Because freedom is not just the ability to choose, it is the ability to act on that choice without immediate consequence. And that ability is directly tied to resources. This is why people with more financial independence behave differently. They tolerate less, they negotiate harder, they walk away faster, not because they are stronger in character, but because they have more room to act. Their decisions are not constrained by survival in the same way. Now reverse that. Reduce someone's access to their own resources and watch what happens. They begin to compromise. They begin to accept conditions they would otherwise reject. They stay in situations longer than they should, not because they want to, but because leaving becomes too expensive. This is how control operates in its most effective form, not through force, but through limitation. When someone's freedom is gradually, it does not feel like control. It feels like responsibility. It feels like obligation. It feels like this is just how things are. And because it feels normal, it is rarely questioned. This is where the idea of entitlement becomes dangerous. Because when one person assumes access to another person's money, they are not just accessing a resource, they are reducing that person's ability to act independently. They are narrowing their margin for error. They are increasing the cost of resistance. And over time, that changes behavior. The person providing begins to think differently. They calculate more. They hesitate more. They feel pressured to maintain a certain level of output, not because they choose to, but because they are expected to. Their time is no longer entirely their own. It is partially claimed. Meanwhile, the person receiving adapts as well. What begins as appreciation can slowly turn into expectation. What was once seen as generosity becomes normalized. And once something is normalized, it is no longer perceived as a benefit, it becomes a baseline. This is how imbalance stabilizes itself, not through conflict, but through gradual acceptance. And this is why the comparison to more extreme systems, while uncomfortable, exists at all, because there is a known structure in which one person's labor is treated as something that can be claimed by another, a structure where output is expected, autonomy is reduced, and resistance carries consequences. The scale may be different, the appearance may be softer, but the underlying mechanism, the belief in entitlement to another person's labor, remains the same. That is the part people resist acknowledging because it forces a reevaluation of something that feels familiar. It challenges the assumption that all forms of sharing are inherently fair. It exposes the possibility that what looks like care can, under certain conditions, function as control. And once you see that mechanism clearly, it becomes difficult to ignore it. In the end, the conversation returns to a simple distinction that most people overlook. There is a difference between giving and being expected to give. When someone chooses to share their resources freely, without pressure, without assumption, that is an expression of agency. It strengthens connection because it comes from autonomy. It is a decision, not a requirement. But when that same action becomes expected, when it is no longer a choice but a baseline, it changes meaning completely. It stops being generosity and starts becoming obligation. And obligation, when tied to something as fundamental as a person's time, effort, and labor, begins to shape the structure of the relationship itself, not openly, not aggressively, but quietly through repeated patterns that go unchallenged. This is why the issue is not about whether people should support each other. Support in a balanced form is part of any healthy relationship. The issue is whether that support is mutual, negotiated, and freely chosen, or whether it is assumed, one-sided, and reinforced by expectation. Because once entitlement enters the equation, the dynamic shifts. One person retains ownership over themselves, the other begins to operate under invisible constraints, and those constraints, over time, limit freedom in ways that are easy to justify but difficult to escape. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the phrase, it is not just about money, it is about who controls the outcome of another person's effort. It is about whether a relationship remains a voluntary exchange between two individuals or becomes a system where one side's role is quietly defined for them. And the only way to prevent that shift is clarity. Clarity about boundaries, clarity about ownership, and clarity about the difference between what is given freely and what is taken by expectation.